Good afternoon. Our next speaker is Rick Rule. Rick Rule recently retired as the chairman of Sprott US Holdings. He now runs Rule Investment Media to educate and help investors become successful. He has made a name for himself for his outstanding record as one of the most successful money managers in the natural resource sector. He is passionate about helping young people succeed and guides them on how to grow their wealth. His topic for the day is hollowing out of the middle class. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rick Rule.
Thank you, Jayant. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start, as I always do, by thanking both Jayant and Rajni. Some of you know that I put on conferences myself, which is analogous to herding cats, except for smart cats. A labor of love. So, Jayant, Rajni, thank you. This morning was, as every capitalism and morality conference is, outstanding. Very high intellectual tone, which, as you can tell by my style of dress, is over. My topic today I owe to Jayant too. I knew that I wanted to speak in front of this audience, but I didn't know about what. And he said, I'd like to hear you talk about the hollowing out of the middle class. And given that I was bored of most of the topics that I speak about, speaking about something new sounded like a wonderful idea. And so I began to think about it. And contrary perhaps to what Jayant wanted, I don't have a conclusion about the hollowing out of the middle class. I don't have a conclusion necessarily whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I guess it depends on where you are in the hollowing out. If you leave the middle class and become wealthier, you probably think your contribution to the hollowing out of the middle class is a good thing. If by contrast you slip, this is a great social ill. I think I have determined this in 4 months of thinking about it. I also learned in thinking about it and studying it a little bit that the hollowing out of the middle class isn't happening, which is sort of perplexing if you look at the data. The catch is if you look at our data. Because if you look at the world as a whole, the middle class isn't shrinking, the middle class is expanding. Deng Xiaoping, I forget what year, said to be rich is glorious, and moved 450 million Chinese from rural penury to what passes in China as a middle-class existence. The hollowing out of the middle class is a Western phenomenon. And I think one observation that I've made that's likely to be popular here is, and by the way, I want to talk about middle class and the hollowing out of the middle class in a material sense. I'm not, for a whole bunch of reasons, going to talk about morals or ethics or politics or all that kind of stuff. Not that I don't care, but that isn't something that I know how to do. I'm going to talk about the material aspect of the so-called hollowing out of the middle class. And I want to point out to you that that's a phenomenon, I think, of developed countries, because the middle class is growing rapidly in frontier and emerging markets. There's a middle class in Nairobi. There's a middle class in Lagos. There's a middle class in Jakarta. There's a middle class in Moscow, whether we choose to admit it or not. The hollowing out of the middle class would seem, from a material point of view, to be a function of mature economies. And I'm going to postulate, without attempting to back it up at all, I'm going to leave this to Maxine to do, I'm going to postulate that the hollowing out of the middle class in developed economies and the emergence of a middle class in frontier and emerging markets is a consequence of individual freedom and liberty. I'm going to postulate that in places that become more free, even gradually more free, they become rapidly more rich. And that places, by the way, I'm going to do this without any backup at all. I'm going to talk about the rest of my speech after and leave you to debate this among yourselves. I'm going to postulate that places that become less free become less rich. And I don't think I need to defend in this crowd the fact that developed economies, by and large, are more redistributive than creative. And in that sense, much less free. And increasingly, at least for what was called the middle class, less rich. I want to begin by two observations. There isn't a middle class. There's several middle classes from a demographic point of view. There's the lower middle class, there's a middle class, and there is the upper middle class. And apparently, if you listen to demographers, at least economic demographers, all of them in the developed world are becoming less numerous. I would point you to Pareto's law. How many people aren't familiar with Pareto's law in the group? You're all familiar with it. Okay, the 80-20 rule. 20% of the population generates 80% of the utility in any given discipline. I want to point out, as I have in several prior years of this conference, that Pareto's law is really a bell-shaped curve. There's a good 20 that generates 80% of the utility, and there's a different 20 that generates 80% of the aggravation, or whatever you'd like to call it. And I'd like to point out, too, that if you take either lip, the good lip or the bad lip, and you run them through the same performance dispersal curve, that they conformably align. A fancy way of saying that 4% of the population generates 80% of the 80%, or 4% of the population generates 65% of the utility, or some number like that. A different 4%, apologies to Max, often senior bureaucrats and elected officials, generate 80% of the disutility, or 80% of the 80% of the disutility. That suggests that a middle class in an unfettered performance dispersal curve should be something like 60% of the population. That percent of the population between the people who overachieve in a function and those people who contribute aggravation to the function. But I want to point out that when you talk about the hollowing out, and I've made the point, but I want to make it one more time. The hollowing out of the middle class isn't a global phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of the West. And if we look at the world, if we look at ourselves in politically correct fashion as humankind as opposed to mankind, I think what you'll see is that the middle class isn't hollowing out at all. It's changing, and we'll talk something about the changes. In talking about the hollowing out from a material point of view of the middle class and the reasons for it, I'm remembered of another great social scientist, not Pareto, in this case Pogo, the cartoon character, who said, "I have met the enemy, and he is us." And so let's talk about some of the reasons for the demise of the middle class in the West. In no particular order, I'm going to give you 6 observations that I have, not conclusions, but rather observations that explain how societies like ours that have everything in the world going for them can still fail for their populations. In no particular order, by the way, credit and artificially low interest rates favor those with financial knowledge and access to credit. Artificially low interest rates penalize savers. They penalize middle-class people who save what surplus they have over and above their cost of living in hopes of providing for their own future. And they subsidize investors and spenders. They subsidize those with financial knowledge and access to credit. While I like to think myself that everything I've accomplished financially in the last 40 years is a function of my hard work and genius, that's a lie, sadly. Yes, I worked hard. No, I'm not a genius. What I had was an artificially low cost of capital and access to credit. I had the ability, as an example, in the real estate business to use 30-year fixed mortgages, even on commercial property. So my cost of capital stayed steady while my return on capital employed increased. The delta between the cost of capital and the return on capital employed is something called wealth. I was able to get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier because I had the knowledge of how to use credit and I had access to credit, and every year for 40 years, my cost of capital went down. Having that access and that realization, of course, I was able to escape the middle class, but most people don't have either of those advantages. It's important to reiterate, artificially low interest rates penalize savers. The existence of the middle class in the United States and Canada, as an example, was often predicated around prudence, around thrift, and in particular around homeownership. And if you don't have the ability to save a down payment, you can't get involved in the credit game. You can't get involved as a part of the middle class. Real estate itself I think is one of the great, or has been one of the great determinants of the middle class, particularly in the North American context, in the United States and Canada. The ability of a young person or a young couple to get a starter home, to fix their occupancy cost, to enjoy a progressively lower cost of capital at the same time that the capitalized value of their investment, expressed by the foregone rent, continued to get better. Everybody with me on this? I think this is, I've thought a lot about this, and I've thought about the way that people who are approximately my age, who got into the middle class and managed to stay in the middle class, have been able to do it relative to younger people today that haven't had access to home ownership and haven't had access to credit. So I think credit and artificially low interest rates in particular have been partially responsible for the demise of the middle class. In a related one of the ex-middle class going to St. Paul's with a drug overdose. I think inflation, too, more than people realize, is responsible for the hollowing out of the middle class. And I have a couple of observations around this. The first is that one of the evidences of financial illiteracy among the middle class, and frankly, poor people and rich people too, is the way they define and the way they measure inflation. The most popular measure of inflation is something called the CPI, which I would suggest to you is not a measure of inflation. It's an artificial construct. As an example, core inflation doesn't include food or fuel. Have a look at me. I eat. I drove. A measure of inflation that doesn't include food or fuel is a sort of a silly measure of inflation, but it's one that's widely believed, including by, quote, the middle class. The CPI, too, is hedonistically adjusted. It seems, however, that my income is seldom hedonistically adjusted up or down. The idea that a computer is more functional today than it was some time ago, irrespective of price, and that as a consequence of that, people at price standards boards or someplace like that can assign an arbitrary hedonistic value to the quality of my car or my computer or my apartment tells me all I need to know about the official inflation standards. But more importantly, I think for the middle class, whoever they are, probably most of us, these measures of inflation don't include tax. For the average Canadian and the average American, at least working Americans and Canadian, taxes are a larger consumer of household income than shelter, food, transportation, or energy combined. Think about that. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, does not include the cost of government. Now, I guess if I didn't have to pay the tax, I wouldn't bitch quite so much about the index. But that's not on offer. And I suspect if you could construct a poll of the so-called middle class in the United States and Canada and ask them about inflation, they would argue that inflation is moderating, and they would argue that the CPI, which is what they read and what they're quoted by the politicians, as being equivalent to the deterioration of the purchasing power of their savings, they don't see the fact that the index doesn't include their largest single cost of living as being something which will cause them to question the inflation that they're suffering. In inflation, renters, an increasing number of so-called middle class or renters get slaughtered. They absolutely, positively get slaughtered. They don't own the asset that they inhabit. But the cost of producing new rental accommodation goes up and up and up, allowing, among other things, for rent increases to go up and up and up. As we saw in the decade of the 70s, the last time that we had inflation that we admitted to, wages lag in inflation. If you have deterioration of the purchasing power of the currency at, say, 10% or 12% compounded, and you get a 7% wage increase, what happens is you've got a 5% wage decrease. We're seeing that now. We're seeing working people or people contributing to economic activity who have bargaining power, winning wage increases that appear to us to be pretty astonishing. Until you realize that for the last 45 years, real wages haven't kept up with inflation. Working people's wages on a cost of living, on a true cost of living basis, going back 45 years, have gone down and down and down. Measured by the amount of hours that someone has to work to buy a house, measured by the amount of hours that somebody has to work to buy a standard car or truck. Yes, the cars and trucks are better, but the number of hours that the average worker, the mean or the median worker, has to work to buy shelter or automobiles, let alone their government, means that real living standards haven't increased in North America for working people for 40 or 50 years. So let's talk about what inflation does in summary to the middle class. Savers get slaughtered. If you are getting, as you are today, let's say that you've shopped well for a certificate of deposit at a bank, if you're getting 4.25%, or if you're in short-term US government securities getting 5%, I would suggest to you that the real rate of the depreciation of the purchasing power of the US dollar is falling by more like 7. If you add in the cost of government as an example, or you don't hedonistically adjust the price of a pound of bacon. The idea that you're getting paid 5% in a currency where your purchasing power is deteriorating at 7% means that every year as a saver you get 2% poorer. Think from the point of view, the economic point of view, of a middle-class person who buys a US 10-year treasury. The US government absolutely, positively guarantees to make you poorer by 2% a year compounded for 10 years. The first promise that my government has made me that I believe will absolutely, positively come true. If I lend them money for 10 years, they will make me poorer in terms of my purchasing power every year for 10 years. Now, that's the value proposition on offer to the middle class. Let's talk more, too, about the impact, I would suggest the pernicious impact on the middle class of social rents. The middle class, almost by definition, don't have the margin between income and expense or the return on capital that the rich have. The poor don't have to worry about that because they have neither. We aren't talking about the poor this year. Maybe I'll do that next year if Giant invites me back. But let's talk about the impact of social rents on the middle class and on middle class savings and middle class incomes. Taxes are not indexed to inflation. So what happens from the point of view of a taxpayer is that you get an increase in tax without an increase in the tax rate. The fact that the gradations on income tax and the fact that capital gains tax isn't indexed to the reduction of the purchasing power of the median means that every year your taxes go up, irrespective of whether you feel them going up or not. Secondly, preferential tax, tax credits, tax preferences benefit, I hate to say it, but it's true, me. Accelerated depreciation, not that I do it, but if I wanted to, as an example, invest in windmills or solar farms, if I wanted to invest in forms of energy that didn't work without tax credits, which, by the way, I have done in the past. I'm a reformed credits investor. If I wanted to do that, I would have access to it. The whole concept of depreciation, frankly, while it is a real economic fact that needs to be acknowledged in tax policy, is something that doesn't benefit the middle class who doesn't have access to investments that they can depreciate. Let's look, as an example, at the North American pipeline industry to understand this. You are allowed to depreciate well, first of all, this is really cool. I hope this speech doesn't reach the policymakers. The intangible cost of putting in a pipeline, all this permitting and all this kind of stuff, you get to expense it. You benefit You benefit from it for the useful life of the pipeline. It might be $80 million, or 80 years, pardon me, but you get to expense it. You get to write it off in year one. Not a bad deal. With regards to depreciation, the pipe itself, you are allowed to depreciate on a double declining basis for, if my memory serves me well, in the United States, 30 years. In Canada, 20 years. The useful life of this pipeline is probably 50 years. The pumps, where you're pumping this goop along, or the compressors, if you're pumping gas along, you're allowed to depreciate in 5 years with a 12 or 15-year useful life. The tax laws, as they're constructed, and I'm not saying that they're constructed improperly, but they are constructed in a way that benefits the wealthy, not necessarily at the expense of the middle class, but in a way that the middle class doesn't have access to unless they are able to save or invest. Governments, too, increasingly as they expand, have found that harvesting cash from the rich isn't a particularly efficient means of raising the revenue they need. Increasingly, governments go after the low-hanging fruit. What's the low-hanging fruit? Goods and services tax. They don't have to collect it. They make every merchant out here, in effect, a sheriff without a gun. Their tax collector is every vending machine, every merchant, every purveyor of service in the economy. And they get to take this as a revenue off the gross, not a piece of the net, which is what other forms of taxation are. So the middle class, relative to the economic surplus that they would like to enjoy, find themselves being larger rather than smaller contributors to what the politicians laughingly call the commonwealth. And in that sense, I think that we need to look at the hollowing out of the middle class as being often, and in very large measure, the fault of the institution that's allegedly set up to protect the middle class. I was thinking the other day about addressing this topic to Canadians in the Vancouver context. And I want to point out an interesting paradox about fiscal policy in Canada. You know that in Vancouver, I'm sure most of you know, they've had rent control here since 1974. Parenthetically, one of the reasons why there's not much rental product here. They haven't built much rental product here, at least legal rental product, since 1974. And it occurred to me that if this market really wanted a fair form of rent control, what they would index apartment rents to would be the rent that the city itself charges on parking spaces. A parking space now, which is adequate for one car, what's that, maybe, I don't know, how big's a car? 3 meters this way by 2-3 meters that way. I mean, the per square foot rents that the city charges for parking exceed the per square foot rent of most rental accommodations for humans in Vancouver, despite the fact that parking stalls have no toilets, although they're frequently used as toilets. They have no kitchens, no bathrooms, anything like that. And the rate of escalation that the government has been able to charge in the rents that they receive on parking meters relative to the rent increases that landlords have been able to charge for apartments tells you really all that you need to know about rent control. But rent control itself is very difficult, I think, for the middle class. If you look at the vacancy rate or the rate of increase in rents in Calgary, although it's a political issue in Calgary, relative to Vancouver, what you see is that markets like Calgary or Seattle, we can call it two analogs to Vancouver, communities that don't have rent control, which is in effect an indirect tax, a preference, if you will, a policy as opposed to a direct tax, have much more rental vacancy and much lower costs per square foot. And I'm going to argue, I think, that social rents, taxes, fees, regulatory expenses, rise in real and nominal terms. And because people in the middle class generate less economic surplus and have less savings and less access to credit, these increases in the real and nominal costs of government impact the middle class more than they do any other social or political strata. But that's enough about blaming other people. By the way, I don't feel part of my government, so I can regard them as other people. I'll move on from that. We have ourselves to blame as middle-class people, too. One of the ways that people exit the middle class on the upside is skills, self-skills. And as a society, we've done a very poor job of upgrading ourselves personally, that is, taking responsibility for our own future. Those people who availed themselves of some form of education, it didn't have to be higher education, it could be acquiring skills that were in demand in the economy, have found that remaining a part of the middle class, but in the upper strata of the middle class, or ascending from the middle class to the rich, have had a pretty good time of it in the last 40 or 45 years. The acquisition of skills meant that you had access to tech employment, or financial services employment, or various other ends of high-end employment. This has not been an economy that didn't have mobility. This is an economy where jobs go begging in that part of the economy that desperately needs workers. It's not that people are being forbidden from entering technology employment. It's not, where's Terry Salmon? Terry, raise your hand if you're still in the room. Yeah, I mean, it's not like when Terry had Salmon partners that he wouldn't admit a high-end person, irrespective of their background, into the investment banking business if they could produce. It's that he couldn't find enough people to grow with. And we have ourselves to blame for that. Yes, perhaps the collective decided that we should do, the effects of gender on basket weaving or something like that. And some people bought into it. But the truth is that there is social mobility for those people who choose to grab it. It just hasn't been easy to grab. But another thing I think that we need to talk about in line of the first discussion we had, which is to say that the middle class isn't shrinking, it's globalizing, is the effect of globalization and contestability. The ascent of 3 people to the middle class in China probably means the diminishment of economic activity for 1 person in Canada as we globalize access to the middle class by shifting employment from those people who are less economically efficient to those people who are more economically efficient. In other words, in places like India, in places like China, in places like Mexico, you attain a middle class lifestyle with less income, which means that you can compete with workers in high income countries that demand more for the same output. Globalization, while it's been wonderful for the consumer, and I'm more a consumer, has been difficult on people who didn't have the ability to handle the contestability of what they do. As manufacturing has shifted, as an example, from the North American heartlands or the European heartlands to frontier markets, we have expanded the middle class on a global basis at the same time that less competitive, more sclerotic economies in the Western world have experienced a hollowing out of their middle class as a consequence of globalization and contestability. 2, technology, I think, automation and redundancy has been very hard, both on the middle classes and on the lower classes. When you talk about the phenomenon that Bill Bonner describes, which is to say that real wages for working people in the United States have gone nowhere for 60 years. This is not, that's right, for 60 years. This is not out of context with increasing automation. The fact that we can employ capital to replace labor in many circumstances. Now, many people look at the substitution of capital via automation for labor as being of benefit to the rich rather than of benefit to the rest. But the rest are also consumers. And if you look at what you are able to buy in the context of manufactured goods, as an example, or in the fact that the real cost of food as a percentage of the household budget in 60 years has fallen by half, you will see that in terms of the maintenance of middle-class lifestyles, if you can maintain your income, automation has been a good or at least a neutral thing. That notwithstanding, automation and redundancy has been very hard, along with globalization, on the middle class. I remember probably 10 years ago when there began to be a political movement in the United States to arbitrarily increase the minimum wage in the United States from whatever it is now, $8, something like that, to $15. Being that I was much more actively employed at that point in time as an investor, I always kept track myself of what types of investments I was being offered. Not that I was going to take them up on it. I do other things for a living. But all of a sudden, when the discussion in California was an increase in the minimum wage from $8 to $15, I began to see an absolute rash of proposals to me to automate clerical and fast food. The idea that they were going to double the cost of labor in the clerical industry and the fast food industry meant that all of a sudden everybody who was going to do a widget to do XYZ was all of a sudden going to do an algorithm which replaced fast food workers and replaced clerical workers. And the circumstance I suspect that we saw as a consequence of the success of government and labor in raising the human rent of labor in the economy in the 1950s and 60s was a real revolution around the application of capital to reduce the labor cost as a component in the production of finished goods, which has been difficult. Are you trying to tell me I need to get out of here? 2 minutes, okay. Well, I'll be as quick as I can. The fourth point that I wanted to make is around preference. How many people here are familiar with Mike Rowe? Mike Rowe is the guy who did Dirty Jobs. Mike Rowe points out that in the United States society, there are 11 million jobs in the trades and in manufacturing that pay middle-class wages that can't be filled. There are a bunch of people in the United States, I don't have any stats that'll tell you how, this is all anecdotal, but there's a bunch of people in the United States who would appear to prefer genteel poverty. That is to say, they've trained for occupations that don't pay, as opposed to,
7.2 million.
Pardon me?
7.2 million.
Thank you. So in some senses, I would suggest that the exodus from the middle class has been voluntary, which is to say that employee preferences, human preferences, haven't driven them to employment. Hasn't me either, I decided to ascend, but that's a different question. That there has been a preference around avoiding jobs that allowed people to stay in the middle class. That may be a function of the fact that big government has instituted complacency, which is to say that many people seem to believe that society will take care of them. I think you only need to look at the insolvency of Social Security to understand how that will serve you in the future. And finally, I can say this. I've graded now 80,000 portfolios in a program I have that grades people natural resource portfolios. And what I've learned about the middle class and frankly the rich class is that the level of financial literacy in the United States and Canada is appalling. It is truly, truly, truly appalling. The amount of understanding that people have about the rudiments of investment or the rudiments of inflation or the rudiments of how they might interact with the economy, if you spent time looking at it, would absolutely astonish you. So, in summary, I'm reminded of a speech that Ayn Rand gave at the New Orleans Investment Conference in 1980. This is in terms of our participation in the hollowing out of the middle class. She was asked, Ms. Rand, what of the poor? Her answer, don't become one. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.